I played every Kid Icarus game. Here's my thoughts. This video is going to be a broad overview of Kid Icarus and maybe even some other related media. This is a series that's been around about as long as all of Nintendo's other legacy IP like Mario, Zelda, and Metroid, but it feels like it gets significantly less fanfare than those other series. Either way, today we're checking it out, and that's partly possible thanks to my amazing patrons, including Melancholis in the Omega Gamer tier, and that's just Ash and Duo Meg Cupon in the Played Every Game tier, along with these absolutely fantastic people you see on your screen. Additionally, I really want to thank this video's sponsor. I play a lot of games, and some come and go, never to be touched again. But one game that I always find myself coming back to is Raid Shadow Legends, who is also the sponsor of this video. Raid Shadow Legends is an action-packed, free-to-play RPG with over 80 million players all over the world. In this game, you can collect tons of really cool heroes and build your party to take on tons of powerful enemies. Plus, there's a lot of heroes, and they all look really cool. And this game's got some great art direction and gives you the same graphical experience as a full PC or console release, but on a mobile device. Now you might be wondering, what does RAID stand for? Here's what I think. R, rare champions with super cool aesthetics. A, the arena, where you can duke it out with other players. I, insane variety in the number of party compositions you can make. D, dungeons galore that you can challenge to fight all kinds of enemies. RAID always has cool stuff going on too, including a ton of events all the time and even fun holiday-specific events. And that's not all. RAID is doing a huge event for its 4th anniversary, meaning dedicated offers, free gifts, and even a brand new event where you can get an anniversary-themed legendary champion. Oh, and if you want a big boost to your arsenal, check out the Amazon Prime drop. It has powerful Savage gear and it's available until March 30th. Download Raid Shadow Legends today using my QR code and get a free starter pack with this awesome in-game loot. Lately, I've been trying my best to take out this clan boss in my clan, so if you want to help me out with that, use the link in the description or the QR code on the screen and join my clan. Raid is a lot of fun, and if you're on the fence, I highly recommend giving it a shot. Thank you, Raid, for sponsoring this video. Alright, let's get into the games. Kid Icarus was released in Japan in 1986 for the Famicom and in Western countries on the NES in 1987. In this game, you play as a little guy named Pit, and contrary to what it looks like, he definitely cannot fly. Well, technically not. Visually, this game is, well, I don't want to hate on the style, but it's pretty basic. The backgrounds are all just big solid colors, and the general layouts of these levels are stone platforms that sometimes have little variations in them to distinguish the different levels. Some levels are busier than others and can have a bit of detail, but the blank backgrounds really do detract from the overall style in my opinion. Gameplay-wise, you control Pit, and you can move left and right, jump up, and fire arrows in those same directions. This is a pretty straightforward platformer, meaning that making these precise jumps while avoiding obstacles, damage pits, and enemies is the challenge. However, even more challenge lies in this game's permanently scrolling nature. This means that when you've left something behind, you cannot go back. In the first level, for example, you're moving pretty much straight up. However, if you fall back down below the bottom of the screen, you're dead, even if there was a platform down there. In the side-scrolling levels, once you've gone right, you can't go back past the screen border to the left. I'm assuming this was a technical limitation that they worked into the game's design, and I think it meshes well with the kind of difficulty this game is going for. On top of that though, Pit does feel kinda slippery in his movement. When you're moving, there's this kind of momentum that almost makes it feel like he's always walking on ice, which is sometimes frustrating, but I eventually got used to it for the most part. I'll talk about the difficulty a bit more later. There are a variety of enemies in this game that you can fire your arrows at, ranging from little snake guys that come out of jars to these wizards that turn your head into an eggplant. I hate these wizards. While you're traversing the levels, you'll sometimes run into a bunch of different optional doors. Going into these, in my experience, can only be done once. When you leave, the door closes and locks you out. There's a few types of these kinds of doors too. The first is shops, where you can spend your hearts, which you gain from defeating enemies. In these, you can usually buy one of 3 items, and a few examples of the kinds of items that you can buy are mallets, chalices that restore your health instantly, bottles that restore your life when it hits 0, and angel feathers that can save you from falling into the bottom of the screen one time. time. There's apparently also a haggling system in this game. I read about it online and apparently it requires you to use a second controller, but I didn't try it here. Occasionally you'll run into these treasure chambers. In these, there's a bunch of platforms with mystery jars and you can shoot these jars to uncover goodies, usually in the form of hearts or other collectibles. However, one jar has a god of poverty and uncovering this causes all unopened jars to disappear. You're then booted out of the room. If you manage to open every jar without hitting a bad jar, you can then finally hit the bad jar to get an additional item. I enjoy these little treasure rooms. They're a fun little luck game and a nice reprieve from some of the challenges that you face in the standard levels, and they also show up pretty often too. Another chamber you can run into is this kind of training challenge chamber where you have to defeat a ton of enemies. Beating these chambers can give you a special item that can power Pit's attacks up. However, at least for the one that I picked, the upgraded attacks only work if you have a certain amount of life power. This kind of reminds me of the older Zelda games where having full life gave you a beam projectile. Throughout the game, you collect these mallets that I mentioned earlier, and they can be used to break these little statues to free the centurions inside. Doing this actually benefits you later on because these centurions come back to help you against fortress bosses. Speaking of fortresses, these are the most challenging levels in the game. The fortresses are labyrinthian areas full of challenging enemies and sometimes tricky platforming. Once you clear a fortress, you fight the boss at the end. As you clear levels and progress in this game, your score determines what kind of health and strength upgrades you get as you move forward. While health is pretty straightforward, your overall strength, which determines how much damage you do, is determined by this invisible number, and it's constantly changing depending on, I guess, nearly every action you perform in the game. You can see a visual representation of your strength on the start menu, but the game doesn't really make it clear as to what the requirements are to increase your strength. There's certain rooms that you can run into, and if Zeus shows up and you've cleared these invisible requirements, he'll give you an additional arrow, which means that your strength is increased by 1. It's just kind of confusing, and I honestly don't fully understand it, so I'm not even gonna try to explain it. If you just play the game normally, I guess you can just expect to get a gradual strength increase either way. So, I'm gonna be real. This game is kinda hard. Like, 80s hard, so it's to be expected, but still hard. I expected to be able to play through this game in, I don't know, a day max, but it turns out I'm bad. Even save scumming with save states, this game was a time sink for me. This is definitely a skill issue, of course, and it's just one that I could not overcome. Later on in the game, you do eventually get a straight-up flight upgrade for the last mission, making it an on-rails shooting type of affair before the final boss, which is kinda neat actually. One thing I will mention that I didn't get to capture here, this game has multiple endings based on how well you perform in the game. This is pretty neat for a game from this era. It's only slight variations, of course, but it's still cool. Now, there was actually a re-released version of this game for the Nintendo 3DS that included full 3D depth, which I obviously can't show here, but it also included some changes like slightly improved visuals, more varied colors, and the addition of actual backgrounds to the stages. There's also a file select rather than a password system, and it feels almost like Pit controls a little bit better, but that could be more of like a placebo imagination thing. Either way, this version of the game definitely feels like a minor improvement over the original, but only a tiny amount. The backgrounds and improved colors are definitely the best part of this, but otherwise it feels exactly the same, as it should. So, at the end of the day, Kid Icarus is a pretty standard platformer from the early days of platformers. It's one of those games that I don't think I'd recommend to the modern gamer unless you really have an itch to go back and experience some Nintendo history. And before I move on, I just want to say this game's actually got a pretty solid soundtrack, and the big themes that you hear throughout the game are definitely memorable earworms. I looked it up, and the guy behind the music is actually pretty legendary, and he came up with the soundtracks to a ton of classics, and many of these themes are still used in these franchises today. Kid Icarus of Myths and Monsters was released for the Game Boy in the United States in 1991 and Europe in 1992. Weirdly, the game's original Game Boy release never came to Japan for some reason. Visually, this game's style is different from the first games, but I weirdly kind of prefer it. Of course, since this game is a Game Boy game, there's only a couple of colors at any given time, and that's only if you're not playing it in its default grayscale. But while there are only a couple of colors, the actual artwork feels a lot more stylized in a way, probably due to the limitations of the Game Boy. But you know what? There's backgrounds! And while they are pretty basic, having something here is a really nice change and it's really easy on the eyes. What isn't so easy on the eyes though is how cluttered everything can feel at times. Sometimes it can be kind of hard to tell what is a hazard and what is just stage dressing, like these weird cobweb things that damage you or the grassy areas and trees in this level that don't damage you but definitely look like they do. This game is also a lot more open-ended than the first and you can immediately tell through the level design choices. Now you can scale up and down on platforms, go back in levels, and it almost feels like there's multiple routes you can take. The permanent scrolling is gone entirely. In fact, these levels can feel almost labyrinthian in their design at times because, while they're really not that big, they do scroll infinitely over the same things over and over, which took me a while to realize. Pit himself controls similarly to the original game, but this time movement feels a lot more responsive for some reason. Additionally, there's now this kind of fall dampening you can do by repeatedly pressing jump while mid-air. This makes you fall a bit more slowly and gives you a little more control over where you land. All of that being said, this game also brings over pretty much everything we saw in the first game with some additional enemy types. Stuff that's come back include challenge rooms, fun little treasure rooms, shops, and fortresses with their bosses. Increasing your strength in this game seems a bit more transparent and straightforward, but only a bit. While I don't know exactly the requirements to grant you a strength increase, I did find a pretty consistent strategy to increase my strength. There are these rooms that you can go into, and Zeus will gift you another arrow, which adds 1 to your strength, and you can see your total strength on the start menu, just like the last game. Sometimes though, he won't give you an arrow, and my solution to that? Just dedicate some time in every level to just spam defeat a ton of these infinitely spawning snakes, and that usually takes care of it. Okay, I guess when I said transparent, I just meant that I experimented a bit and kinda just started cheesing it. I still honestly have no idea how this works. Anyways, listen, this game, in my opinion, is actually a huge improvement over the first game. I enjoyed my time with it significantly more thanks to the different level design concepts and the generally more manageable difficulty. That being said, I still couldn't really make myself wholeheartedly enjoy this game. I don't know what it is. It's genuinely a good game, and I can see why people enjoy it. I just personally don't. This isn't the first time this has happened with a game for me, but it is the first time that it's happened with a game that I've covered on my channel. I mean, of course, I've played some pretty unenjoyable games for the channel, but in this case, there's really nothing wrong with this game or even the first game. I'm just not enjoying them. Looking at it objectively, though, I still would recommend this game. In fact, I would say explicitly to skip the first game and just go straight to this one. It's honestly a more fun experience out the gate. Kid Icarus Uprising was released for the Nintendo 3DS in 2012. You can tell that this game's direction and style were influenced by the same people that made the Super Smash Bros. Games. It's pretty immediately obvious. Visually though, this game actually looks excellent. I love the style. It's got that Super Smash Bros. Charm to it, and in fact, not only does it have the modern Super Smash Bros. Look, it even seems to use a lot of the sound effects and some visual effects from the recent Smash Bros. Games too. At least sounds and effects that are incredibly similar, but either way, this game's set pieces, sound design, visuals, and general tone are incredible. There's full voice acting too, and listening to Pit and Palutena interact is always fun.
They have a fortress near the entrance to the underworld in Reaper Valley.
Which is where? Reaper Boulevard? But seriously, thank goodness we don't have to go there, right? That silence means we have to go there, doesn't it?
Even the tertiary characters and bosses are fully voiced, and the dialogue is super clever and well written and fun and never seems to take itself too seriously. Something I really love though is the throwbacks to previous games. A lot of the enemies you fight are the same enemies you fought in the 8-bit games, and the game will literally show you their sprites to remind you who they are. This also means that the previous games are considered canon and their events are actually referenced multiple times. This is super neat and a fun little way to reward those that have played the previous games. Ah damn it, the dumb eggplant guy is back though. The gameplay here is split up into 2 modes. The first one is this on-rails one that feels a lot like a Star Fox-esque rail shooter. Tons of enemies fly up to you and you have to use the reticle to shoot them. While it may look like Pit can actually fly here, the story explanation is that Palutena gives him a pseudo-flight where he can fly but she controls it. Anyways, you can use the left circle pad to move Pit around the screen and the stylus to aim at enemies. Hitting the L button fires a stream of projectiles, but not pressing it for a short length of time charges up a stronger projectile, which kind of rewards you for not just constantly spamming the fire button, I guess. While you're in the flying sections, you also have a limited number of special screen wipe attacks that do a ton of damage to everything on the screen. The second mode is the on-foot missions. With these, you have full control of Pit and you can run around in these fully 3D stages. The other controls are still the same, but this time if you're near an enemy, Pit will use a melee attack instead of firing a projectile. I have a lot more to say about the controls in this game, but I'll get to that. In these explorable sections, you're typically on a linear path to find the stage's boss, but on the way, you can go off the beaten beaten path to find extra goodies like treasures and other special items. Typically, a mission will start with the flying section and then transition to an on-foot section. I want to give special attention to the boss fights in this game though. These are really cool, especially for a 3DS game. They managed to have this sense of scale and impact that you typically don't see in a lot of games like this. While it's hard to convey without showing the entire mission building up to it, these cool boss set pieces definitely feel earned and almost always have really interesting dialogue going throughout them too. So because this game is broken up into different missions, during missions you can unlock a bunch of gear and earn hearts as currency. Between missions you can customize your equipped gear and use heart points to unlock different gear. There's also a pretty big variety of gear broken down into different weapon types like bows and cannons, all with differing stats and effects. What's really cool is that every different piece of gear has a different kind of projectile in it. Different projectiles have different appearances and effects when they're fired. This is neat and gives the game quite a bit of visual variety and makes every weapon feel distinct. You can also take weapons you found and either convert them back into the hearts currency or use them with another weapon to get something new. There's a practice range that you can use which allows you to practice using your gear in air or land battles without having to fully go into a mission. When starting a mission, you can choose the intensity of the mission. By default, the intensity is automatically set to a specific level, but you can increase it or decrease it at the cost of hearts. Increasing it increases the difficulty, but also increases the rewards, while the inverse is true for decreasing it. This definitely reminds me of another game. Between missions, you're able to shop for new weapons with acquired hearts, go into the practice range, modify gear, and look at your treasure collection. So this game has a vault mode, which includes stuff like a music player for unlocked music, a mode called Idols, which is a model viewer that lets you look at characters and items from the game, and an option called Idle Toss. Idle Toss allows you to use these eggs that you earn from playing or using 3DS play coins. The idea is that you put eggs on this tray and toss it into the air to unlock new items for the Idols menu, and over time it takes more and more eggs to unlock new items. Of course, I'm gonna keep making Super Smash Bros. Comparisons and say that this works nearly identical to how Super Smash Bros. Has handled its trophies in previous games. So I don't want to come off like I'm hopping on a bandwagon since everyone complains about this, but I really need to talk about this game's controls. Because this is on the 3DS and the 3DS didn't have a second analog stick for the first few years, the control scheme for this game is unwieldy to say the least. Moving Pit around in the air and on the ground is all done with the circle pad, which is fine. However, all reticle, targeting, and camera control is done via the bottom touchscreen using the stylus. This is just plain uncomfortable. While you're in the air doing the on-rails sections, it's not that bad, but once you're on foot, in my opinion, it becomes a nightmare. Moving the camera requires you to quickly slide the stylus across the screen, and if you want to stop, you have to quickly tap the screen. For some reason, my smooth brain could not get used to this, so controlling Pit just felt awkward the entire time. And of course, you could say, why not just use the Circle Pad Pro or the new 3DS's second Circle Pad? Well, I'll have you know that this game does support the Circle Pad Pro, at least from what I read, but only for moving Pit if you're left-handed, which is nice, but there's no way to use both sticks in tandem to move and aim Pit's reticle. In fact, this control scheme was so wonky, a lot of copies of this game included a special stand for the 3DS solely to help people play this game more comfortably. When I say that the one thing holding me back from enjoying this game is the controls, I am not exaggerating at all. I love the art style, I love the voice acting, I love the gameplay loop, but I just can't get past these controls. It makes the game feel like a chore, and that sucks because this is a really great game. And I know that the controls are something that a lot of people can get used to and have looked past, but for me, it's just a deal breaker. It's the main reason I haven't finished the game. This is an example of a game that would be 100% perfect for me, with the simple addition of dual analog controls. And honestly, this game deserves to be brought back on like a modern system anyways. Don't get me wrong, I love literally everything else about this game. This is a really great game in every other way, just like the controls. Speaking of how good this game is, this game came out with quite a bit of fanfare, but outside of Super Smash Bros., we really haven't seen anything significant come out of Kid Icarus since. Of course, Masahiro Sakurai, the game's director, has implied that we probably won't see any more from this series for a long while, so I wouldn't hold my breath. Would I recommend Kid Icarus Uprising? I guess it depends. If you're the kind of person who doesn't care about weird control schemes, then this is definitely a masterpiece of a game that I would highly recommend from what I played. However, if you're someone who struggles with this kind of control scheme, absolutely not. I hate to go to extremes here, but it's the truth. It's a great game with one gigantic, huge, massive flaw. So I don't normally do this, but this isn't really the longest series of games, so let's talk about Pit's appearances and other stuff for a second. So this series will eventually get its own video, but WarioWare is known for its gameplay being a series of micro games, one after another. Pit actually appears briefly in a few of these. This isn't an exhaustive list by any means, but I did want to show you a couple of examples. First is WarioWare Twisted, and this entry is unique for using the Game Boy Advance's accelerometer attachment. This means that you can tilt the Game Boy Advance to control the game, and one set of these micro games are all based on classic Nintendo games, like Metroid, Donkey Kong Jr., Excitebike, and, of course, Kid Icarus. Pit shows up in this little minigame here where you have to avoid the damn eggplants! In WarioWare Smooth Moves for the Wii, there are even more classic throwbacks like Star Fox, but also relatively more recent games like The Legend of Zelda: The Wind Waker. Pit appears in this minigame, though, where you have to move the Wii Remote to conduct an orchestra, but only if you make it far enough to the version of this minigame with the increased difficulty. He doesn't appear in the versions before that. Outside of WarioWare, he's got a few more appearances in some early Nintendo games, but of course I also have to mention the Super Smash Bros. Games. While he wasn't playable, you could actually unlock a trophy of him in Melee for the GameCube. This is before his big redesign, so this, to my knowledge, is the very first time we see him in 3 dimensions, and also the only time we see this version of him in 3 dimensions too. In Super Smash Bros. Brawl, he returns, but this time as a playable character along with an entire stage called Skyworld. He's redesigned from the ground up and actually has a voice too. In Super Smash Bros. For the 3DS and Wii U, and also Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, both Dark Pit and Palutena were added, along with some additional stages. Of course, Dark Pit plays nearly identical to Pit, but it's still cool to see him here nonetheless, and Palutena has a distinct moveset from both of them and is also a lot of fun to play. It's kind of interesting looking at how Pit from Brawl might have influenced the 3DS game. And that's it for every Kid Icarus game. So this is the first time I've made a video where I didn't really find much enjoyment playing any of the games. It's not burnout or anything, I just don't think the Kid Icarus series is for me. Conceptually, it's a really cool series and I really loved Uprising outside of that one huge flaw, but I just didn't get much out of it otherwise. I think that this is specifically a me problem though and doesn't at all reflect on the actual quality of the series. I understand that because of this and because I didn't fully complete each game for this video, that might be disappointing for some of the people watching, and that's completely fair. That being said, I would rather be truthful with you about my feelings on these games rather than lie to you and fake enthusiasm for games I'm not really enjoying. Anyways, thank you so much for watching and I really hope you enjoyed this video. See you in the next one, and as always, have a fantastic day.